Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. A little bit perturbed about the result of the election. It wasn't what I expected. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think everyone was completely shocked, weren't they? And I think there's a lot to come out of it. It might be good for us to kind of address it maybe next week when I think we've had an opportunity to really think about it. But my initial point is that hopefully it'll kind of it's the death knell of governments going on about GDP and that the economy is growing and expecting everyone to just see that and think, well, if the economy is growing, I'm going to vote for this government. Because what seems to be clear is that the US GDP and the economy has been growing over the last 18 months, but people aren't feeling it. And I think Dirk Entz, who I spoke to earlier, who's an MMT economist, he's now working in European Parliament, said to me, talking about GDP and growth is now kind of narrative of the 20th century. And he said, we really need to start talking about things that make a difference to people: inflation, housing, wages. And he said, if there's one thing to kind of come out of that as a positive, it might be that governments start seeing that they need to address these things and that GDP might not be the desired destination or the measure. So like everyone, I'm trying to look for some positives out of this when there aren't many, if there's any at all. Thankfully, we live in Scotland. So that's my other big positive.
The other thing I was thinking about when you say that is redistribution. That seems to be a dirty word for a lot of people. You know, where I feel that often that this paradigm about growth is it's very careful. It's trying to please everyone, and of course you just can't do that. And what I was reading when I woke up this morning was that the FT put a thing out to say that it was the economy. So there you go. A lot of people were talking about the economy. And again, what you're saying is, you know, the reality is not, you know, affecting people positively. And the other thing is
a thing. It's just a thing. It doesn't really mean anything. And that's, I think, the huge problem is people talk about the economy, but what they mean is wages, cost of living, you know, and inflation, whereas economists and government talk about the economy as in GDP. So these things, there's just a huge disconnect. And I really think this election should help politicians realize that these are the things that need to be addressed, not just spoken about, but addressed.
Yeah. The other thing I think that what I'm gathering, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about the US election in the next weeks or so, was Gaza. Gaza, you know, a lot of people very, very unhappy with the amount of bombs that are being sent over to Israel and obviously causing mass destruction in Gaza. So, but we will get more data on it, I'm sure, and we'll be wiser by next week.
Yeah, I think there's so many lessons to learn. I just hope we learn the right ones. Well, a proper thanks to everyone who's joining us on Twitter, Facebook, and also on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us live. We're going to kind of go back a little bit of the Scotonomics Vaults. One of my favourite sessions from the Festival of Economics that I did with Miriam Brett, looking at the just transition. And there's so much more that comes out of this than just the just transition, but we do go into it in quite a lot of detail. There's a big section on land, and I think considering the show that that's just been on Independence Live and the event in Scotland on Sunday about land, I think that section is, I haven't watched it again today, is absolutely crucial. We talk about ownership, what's happening with that land, carbon sequestration, and all of that stuff. There's so much in this little 40-minute video. I love Miriam. I think she's fantastic. I think she's an absolute star. I'm so glad she's kind of on our side. I really hope you enjoy spending 40 minutes with her. And then Kieran and I will be back at the end. Enjoy this. It is really, really good. We'll see you in a bit. The audience, what is a just transition?
So firstly, on context, to understand the just transition, we need to understand that the climate crisis is inherently linked to inequality, and the causes and distributional consequences of climate and environmental breakdown are uneven and they're unjust. So at a global level, the 1% globally produce as much carbon as the poorest 2/3 of humanity, so that's 5 billion. In Scotland, Future Economy Scotland carried out research which found that the richest 5% of households in Scotland produce over 4 times the carbon footprint of the poorest 5% of households in Scotland. So it's a massive disparity. If we look at areas like private transport, for example, that figure is 10 times. If we look at aviation, that figure is 11 times. So time and time again, we can see that those who have contributed the least to climate and environmental breakdown are often on the sharp end of it. That's true globally, within global regions and countries, but it's also true within countries as well. And what's really clear is that marginal changes to a system that is driving climate and environmental collapse simply won't suffice. So we need bold policy ideas for this. So a just transition, so its origins is interesting because just now some of its opponents, shall we say, often point to the fear of workers losing their jobs to justify what they would see as slower action or inaction completely. Interestingly, and paradoxically to that, the just transition as a concept actually emerged out of the worker movement. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was changes in the regulatory frameworks in the US towards air and water pollution that resulted in folk losing their jobs. And what the workers and trade unions did was organise around that to say, actually, we need interventions here to secure our livelihood. And that's where the term just transition was first coined. Now, since then, it has evolved, its meaning has deepened over time, and it's grown in prominence at a global, national and local level, and directly linking a just transition to proactive climate action as well. And that, the focal point of that changes. If we look to the work of Indigenous groups in North America, for example, there's a huge focus on land rights. For others, it's about green jobs. And so there's different focal points throughout different movements globally. But one way I like to think about a just transition is to envisage it as the foundation for a bridge. And we're on one side of that bridge and we're building that foundation. And to get to it is the social and economic interventions required to get from where we are just now over that bridge to where we want to be. And it's the foundation of that. And so it's through the kind of seismic shift in industrial base towards a low carbon economy where workers and communities can thrive. Now, there is no one single definition of just transition. It's quite hotly contested. But we have a definition at Future Economy Scotland.
Are we going to hear that now?
Yes, is that
Excellent.
okay?
Yep, absolutely.
And so we define it as a coordinated plan to decarbonise Scotland's economy and tackle the nature crisis while firstly creating well-paid, secured, unionised green jobs that are fit for the future. Critically, those jobs need to be in rural and urban Scotland alike. Secondly, supporting the retraining and reskilling of workers as part of a managed decline of carbon-intensive industries. Third, actively reducing social, economic and regional inequalities, alleviating poverty and raising living standards, particularly for low and middle income households. Fourth, around impacted communities. Who is in the room when these decisions are taken really matters. So trade unions, workers, communities need to have a meaningful stake and say over decisions that affect them. Next is fairly sharing the costs and benefits of decarbonisation, including embracing more democratic forms of ownership and governance of our futures, of industries of the future. And lastly, and this is taking in Scotland's role as a current and historic emitter, a significant emitter, recognising global imbalances created by climate and environmental breakdown and building a genuinely reparative approach. So moving forward in a way that does not exacerbate the global structural imbalances that have been created in the fossil age.
About 18 months ago, I did about a 15,000 word report on the just transition, and it's been heavily in use by the Scottish Government for maybe six years, round about 6 years. Lots of papers on it. It's in so many papers. For a kind of a contrast, I went into and did a similar search in government papers in Westminster, and I found it once It was used once, and it was a just transition for the financial services sector. And it was the real issue for me when I thought about the kind of political economy of this. How does Scotland deliver something that Westminster has not in the slightest bit of an interest in? I mean, it's not even on the radar. Where is our agency to deliver a just transition?
Yeah, so I think the kind of question of whether we have the economic levers to deliver this just now, does Scotland, under the current fiscal framework and constitutional settlement, have the ability to fully decarbonise all of our economic activity and do so in a way that's fair and just? No, is the answer to that. If we look, for example, to critical areas of policy and regulatory framework around, oil and gas is a very obvious one. The tax frameworks, the majority of the tax frameworks, the regulatory frameworks and the licensing agreements sit at a reserved level. Similarly, to kind of go back to the questions around macroeconomic change, borrowing powers, having a bank, for example, these are all barriers to the type of change that we need to kind of see a kind of whole-scale transformation of the economy. Do we, however, have the powers to transition to net zero by 2045, which is the target that the Scottish Government has set for itself? It's ambitious, it's 5 years ahead of that of the UK Government. Yes, we do, and we can be doing more around that. So yeah, I think that, and that's what our workers focus on at Future Economy Scotland.
Fantastic.
Do you know how many people in Scotland will have to change jobs in decarbonisation, and will that number be sufficient to provide labour for the new sectors?
So I don't have a total figure of the exact number of jobs that will need to be transitioned. It's seismic, and it's also very regional as well when we look at Scotland here. And I think that was a question that we kind of discussed too, around the kind of regional transformation within Scotland that's required. And just now there is no comprehensive strategy for how we actually do that. And so that takes us back to this is the foundation, and now we need the roadmap to get us there. So if we look at Scotland at a regional level, and Gillian mentioned this as well, obviously the northeast of Scotland, where we have huge numbers of workers employed in the oil and gas sector. I'm from Shetland. We also have huge numbers of workers employed in the oil and gas sector, and kind of questions around how do we reskill and retrain those workers in a way that is aligned with a just transition. What is the targeted investment for impacted communities? Because actually in Scotland, the scars from the last wave of industrial transition are still very visible today. We can see it. And that was a period of rapid and brutal deindustrialisation throughout that ravaged communities in Scotland, the coal and mining communities in particular. We can see that legacy today in homelessness, we can see it in food insecurity, we can see it in fuel poverty levels in those communities today, and it's because it was poorly managed and it wasn't actually a transition, it was just
left to the market, wasn't it? There was no real state involvement at all in that transition.
Yeah, I mean, the state involvement was to decimate it, unfortunately. And so now we've got an opportunity. I think there's an enhanced onus on us now to learn lessons from the past and transition in a way that actually secures livelihoods for workers and a thriving future for impacted communities. So in the northeast, that's targeted investment, it's skills transitions, it's a recognition that we're going to have to fundamentally restructure our industrial base and labour market and answer the very difficult questions that come alongside that to create that roadmap. Similarly, for at a place-based level, if we look at Grangemouth, for example, the recent decision around the oil refinery, that to me is indicative of everything that shouldn't be, because this didn't need to happen. We could have had a transition plan for them. And actually, again, when we talk about industrial transitions, it's so often now around kind of corporate power, actually, because Petro Ineos and, a distant group of shareholders at Petro Ineos have been able to take this decision. And where was the job guarantee for workers? Where is where's the strategy for impacted supply chains domestically? What does that mean for the future of that community in Grangemouth that has been wedded to and to this the refinery for so long? this is happening at the same time as the announcement from Tata Steel that Port Talbot is closing as well. That didn't have to be that way. If we look to Germany, if we look to Sweden, they're transitioning to green steel. And actually what that would have meant was upfront investment. And that could have been done through the government taking some equity stakes in that as well, alongside private sector investment, for example. And actually putting in place a transition plan. Yes, it would have been billions of pounds, but it would have aligned with all the stated objectives of the UK government. They say they want to level up. They say they want, a thriving future for industrial heartlands. They say they want to reinvigorate the north, and actually we've got Scunthorpe and Wales there that actually we could have created a plan for them. And now it's too late and we're at a cliff edge. And that is why it's so important that we don't shy away from the difficult questions just now to ensure that we have that thriving future for workers and communities.
Fantastic. I'd just like to go into a little bit more on this idea of agency, because it seems from what you've said, and I might be picking this up wrong, but it seems like you said we can do a lot more. And then when we're saying, well, actually, what can we do? Use Greenmouth as an example. There's not really much that the Scottish Government could do there, because it doesn't control anything around the labour market. It doesn't have the funds for an industrial strategy. So using that as like a live example, what could the Scottish Government have done or do around the that decision at Grangemouth? Where is the agency?
So the frustrating thing with Grangemouth is that it was publicly owned. So we could have had a lot more democratic agency. And now we don't. And I think what we're seeing is government scrambling to try and pick up the pieces of a decision that's already been made. But there was actually more opportunity to develop a future for Grangemouth. So I think there was an inquiry, or there was some sort of government process.
Was this UK government? Scottish government.
Into what the future of Grangemouth can and should look like. That arguably is far too late. It was far too late, because actually, if we look at Jim Ratcliffe, had been throwing his weight around at Grangemouth for years. If we look right from the start of the 2000s even, there'd been annihilating pensions, they've been docking pay freezes, they've been implementing pay freezes, they've been removed the full-time union workers at Grangemouth as well. So there've been indicators here that actually clearly this was being run in the interests of shareholders, not in the interests of workers in that community. And so it was encouraging to see action that had started to take place around questions at the Scottish Government level around what should we do about Grangemouth and how should we transition that, what are the options for a sustainable future. But it's come too late.
The whole just transition, if it does apply to the whole of Scotland, you've got to make that argument much more visible in the areas like the Southwest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely. And finally, Scotland's appalling weather has benefits. Our wind is coming in handy at last. And yeah, I agree. It needs to be an economic transformation throughout Scotland. And I think I'd argue kind of the current, just on the question of kind of ownership and energy more broadly, like the current energy crisis has really shone a spotlight on long-standing failures of a privatised for-profit energy system. And you're talking about community benefits there, and how does this translate into jobs? How does this translate into benefits for communities throughout Scotland? I think it's important to kind of contextualise the current energy crisis as a kind of a much more kind of long-standing failure here. Because actually what it's done is highlighted the sheer volatility and cost of our continued reliance on fossil fuels, and systemic failures of a privatised market, where we've got an energy system, that needs to be sustainable and affordable, and that means shifting from a privatised system to that's focused on profit extraction. So we've got this perverse situation just now where households are being plummeted into, even more households, I should say, are being plummeted into fuel poverty, while over the last decade, BP and Shell have made tens of millions of pounds in shareholder profits while receiving hundreds of millions of pounds in tax benefits. And, between 2011 to 2021, the big six energy firms paid out almost £23 billion in dividends. That's 6 times their tax bill. That's a fundamentally broken system. that is. And it's emblematic of the wider challenges we face, because it is footloose fossil capital benefiting from eye-watering profits while, you know, real wages are held back and fuel poverty soars. So when we talk about renewables, I think there's an opportunity there to say, how do we do this differently? How do we not simply put a green badge on energy, but replicate some of the extractive approaches that actually didn't benefit communities, that didn't benefit workers? And I think there's real opportunities to do that, because as I'd said, you know, we've dramatically scaled renewable generation, not evenly throughout Scotland. I think you're right to highlight that. But that has not translated yet into maximising the job creation, the good quality job creation, and the benefits to communities as well. So if we look, for example, at Scandinavia, in a lot of Scandinavian countries, the job creation has scaled dramatically alongside the renewable generation. And a key reason for that is because a lot of those jobs are rooted in domestic manufacturing capacity and domestic supply chains. And so that is where we need to focus a lot of our energy on, because actually that's where a lot of those jobs are created. And I just want to point, do I have a moment to point to Scotland?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes,
Sorry.
absolutely.
You can interrupt me if I'm talking too much. I just want to point to a kind of contrast around Scotland. Scotland is a massive, I mean, it's the largest offshore leasing round in the world. It's huge. So it is a real big step in terms of renewable generation. So the Scotland projects in the first round, it's going to total up to, you know, around 27 gigawatts. The taxpayer is getting £750 million in options fees for that. So, you know, that's a fair bit of money, right? But actually, if we compare that to just one community trust in the North West Highlands owns a 500 kilowatt wind turbine, the projected profits for that over the next 20 years for that one community are 4.4 million. So we need to look, when we come to the second round of Scotland, and renewable projects more broadly, we need to get serious about democratic ownership here and what it can bring. And that means looking at equity stakes, that means stronger conditionalities for workers' rights and local job creation, and that means a meaningful approach to scaling our domestic manufacturing capacity. And that should be really linked with the Scottish Government's commitment to introduce a green industrial strategy, which we welcome, and we're also carrying out work on this, which we hope to inform their decisions on.
How do you ensure communities are central to a just transition? Is there any key practical means? Is it through local authorities? Is it development trusts? Or is there any kind of practical examples you can point to?
Yeah, and I am unsurprisingly going to highlight community wealth building as a way to do this. So I've been told I had to have a quick answer. So we've seen an embrace of community wealth building in Scotland over the last 3 years, which is absolutely brilliant. First rolled out in North Ayrshire, now councils throughout Scotland are taking it up. And we need to ensure that it stays true to its roots. It's about local economic transformation. It is about the transfer of financial and physical assets into the hands of local economies and communities. When it comes to energy, that could not be more acute. And I just want to highlight one example here. So in North Ayrshire, which was the first council to roll out community wealth building, and myself and actually many others in the room have been privileged to sit on their expert group for the past few years. North Ayrshire, as a post-industrial area, has a lot of derelict land. And what the council did is put in place plans to develop solar and wind farms on council-owned land. That is going to be council-owned, so they're owned by the public. When those are operational, they're going to generate up to 277% of North Ayrshire's energy needs. The excess can be sold back, and then the surplus from that can be reinvested into the local community. That, to me, is a common sense approach to energy. And so I think that's community wealth building is one important area that we can look to transform how we own and manage energy.
Great. Just a summary and then a question there. You're saying a lot of the problems with energy seem to be related to the fact that it's an energy market. And if you look at other countries in Europe and further afield, energy is not a market. It's, you know, there's much more control involvement by a really powerful regulator or heavy involvement in the state. Is even all these changes that we're talking about, this still plays into energy and within the energy market. Could we be looking at something where we're saying we've got to take away the significant impact and the role of the market in energy if we want to have a just transition?
Yeah, I think shifting towards democratic ownership, and that can take many forms. So that can be public ownership, that can be community ownership, that can look at equity stakes, that can look at community shares. It can be the role of land trust, development trust. There's loads of different forms of democratic ownership. But democratic ownership is absolutely integral to securing a just transition. I think it develops clearly better value for customers. I think at a coordinated level, when it comes to like the state, democratic public ownership can deliver more and better paid jobs and accelerate the rollout of renewable energy infrastructure that the UK so desperately needs. And I just want to raise one example, because the was discussed earlier around the possibility of municipal energy companies as well. I think Craig from Commonweal highlighted that in the other session earlier. Just to give one example of that, in Germany, 2/3 of all electricity is purchased from municipally owned energy companies. So it can be done, and we should be doing it. And yes, there are kind of barriers to what can be done under the current devolved settlement, that I don't think we should ever lean on that as an excuse to not do everything we possibly can just now, because we are facing multiple crises and they require urgent action.
In 2020, the Scottish Government instituted a Scottish Climate Assembly with the express remit of investigating how to achieve a just transition. The report was laid before Parliament in May 2021. Did you know about it, and did it influence any of your thinking?
Yeah, so there's been kind of various initiatives that have taken place that are actually kind of moving us in the right direction, and they're definitely welcomed. I think what's missing is that comprehensive roadmap, and that's what the CCC report highlighted this week. And shameless plug, and I'm so sorry, but over the next 2 years, we at Future Economy Scotland are focusing our efforts on developing the policies and interventions required to create that roadmap. Because we need it to be evidence-based, we need it to be rooted in really rigorous analysis and like shovel-ready policies as well, because the time is now to drive this forward. And really what we're talking about here, and it's no small feat, not underestimating the challenge that we face here, but it's about hardwiring climate and economic justice into every single area of economic activity. And so that necessitates a really broad approach. It's retrofitting homes, it's how our transport system is accessible and sustainable, it's how we pay for a just transition. With just now, kind of under the current constitutional settlement with limited borrowing powers, getting creative about how we pay for a just transition.
2 years, yeah.
What's that?
2 years you're giving yourself for this, to
Yeah.
explain all this. Okay,
Yeah.
well done.
Yeah.
Well done. Good
Wish us
luck with that. Everything I've heard about that in that climate assembly has been hugely positive for the people involved and the outcomes. It's such a shame. I don't know why. I'd love to find out why that hasn't been rolled out and copied. It seems to be a huge success.
Scottish National Investment Bank.
Oh, I was going to ask about that one. That's one of my favourite topics.
What is the potential of that bank to stimulate and steer a just transition?
Sorry, did you say what's the point of that one?
Potential.
Oh, right.
Potential. And is it fulfilling it?
And the question behind?
So I'll be really quick, but firstly on language, I think you're right. It's about trying to develop a narrative that gets across what the messages that we want to get across. I don't think think tanks have always got this right. I don't think politicians have always got this right, and there's much more work that needs to be done to make that accessible and appealing to folk, because quite a lot of the time it can be wrapped up in inaccessible jargon. And as much as I'd love to think that everybody wants to read our reports, there is a limited audience that do. And so it's also about trying to get your message out there in different channels. I'd say we've been quite pleasantly surprised. We launched in May last year. We've been quite pleasantly surprised with the range of media that's been interested in covering our work, which is kind of a really encouraging sign. That's obviously not the kind of bigger fight that you're talking about there. But I think you're right. There needs to be a lot more work to develop accessible language when we're talking about ideas, be it community wealth building or just transition, because also I think people can lose hope because they're thinking, what's this new jargon we're talking about here?
Because the right wing has got this, haven't they, with these kind of phrases like the 15-minute city, which is, or 15-minute, it's the barrio concept that comes from Spain, where I live. But no, I remember speaking to someone in Dundee, and she told me what her understanding of this barrier culture was. And I had said I've lived in Spain for 10 years, and it looks nothing like what you're describing that is going to happen.
Yeah.
But she had a clear idea that this was about restricting movement.
Yeah,
and it's really difficult to counter that narrative. It seems to be.
Never underestimate the right's ability to turn literally anything into a culture war. Because what it's trying to do is divide people. That's at the heart of all of the culture war. And they're trying to loop climate into that just now as well. And I think that's when we have to push back successfully at times, and we have to push back and say, push back and say this is about economic justice and a sustainable future for communities, and actually this is about reducing inequality. If we look, for example, at something like air pollution, which a lot of those, the low emission zones are trying to tackle, if we look at who's impacted by air pollution, it is overwhelmingly poor people. It is overwhelmingly Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people. And that is the reality of this. We had the first death in the UK that was actually, proven in court to have been contributed by air pollution, and it was a wee girl, it was a child. And so that's what we're dealing with here. And I think, there'll be always the efforts to divide us, because they know we're less powerful if we're divided, if we turn on one another, if working class communities turn on one another, if we can direct the anger that should be directed at an unjust and extractive economic system and turn it on marginalised communities. And we just cannot let that happen, because we need to be united here.
Fantastic. Second question on SNIB.
SNIB. So SNIB,
Scottish National Investment Bank.
Scottish National Investment Bank. Yeah, so I'll be quick here again. Sorry. I think the creation of the Scottish National Investment Bank is a potentially very transformative thing. I was really disappointed to see the contracts awarded for the implementation of it to a lot of big consultancy firms and accountancy firms, and I think it's a detriment. Has had detrimental outcomes to how it operates today. I still think there's opportunity to reform how it's operating, and actually we look at areas of community wealth building, for example, and what it can and should be investing in, and also land and energy and community energy projects. There's huge scope to try and reorient its focus towards one that's genuinely aligned with a just transition. And so we are going to be doing more work on that in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that.
I think it's been a spectacular failure on every level, including its setting up in management. And I genuinely think it's a huge embarrassment for the Scottish Government of how ineffective it is and how poorly it's viewed. And I actually had an insider at Deloitte talking about the process, and I was absolutely shocked about how it moved forward. So I think there's huge concerns.
I think on flooding more broadly, there are huge areas of Scotland that are massively at risk of flooding. There are huge areas of Scotland that are already experiencing flooding. If we look at flood-prone areas, realistically, homes are not going to be insurable there for very much longer. And so I think that's why we need to get serious about flood prevention, and also, looking to afforestation, for example, is an obvious one. Peatland restoration as well, nature restoration more broadly as a mechanism for flood prevention, but also looking at kind of what our role has been in creating this crisis and how that should drive forward a rapid and just transition. Because, as I said, those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are going to be disproportionately at the sharp end of that. They're not going to be able to pay for the adaptation measures required to keep them safe. And flooding is a really good example of that.
What's your views of the idea of carbon sequestration and new woodland creation and the reparation of peatland? How do you think this ties in to just transition?
How land is owned, used and managed is key to securing a just transition, and Scotland's land market has very distinct features that have been shaped through its culture, its history, its politics, its language. We have, firstly, despite waves of really promising legislation, land reform legislation is undoubtedly one of the greatest achievements of the creation of the Scottish Parliament, hands down. We still today, however, have a very concentrated land ownership structure. We have a huge rural land mass. Around 98% of Scotland's land mass is classified as rural or remote, but as somebody from a rural place, I reject that term. We have a largely unregulated land market. Anybody in the world or company in the world can buy land with very few questions asked. That makes us a freak internationally, frankly. And we have very generous tax and subsidies for landowners. Now, what all of those things together have done is created a kind of perfect storm, if you like, to make Scotland very attractive to investors seeking to purchase land for carbon offsetting and natural capital activities. There are issues with that fundamentally as an approach. There are many people who say, why are we turning nature into an asset class? Are we effectively asking, those who are arsonists also put out the fires in doing this?
Yes.
The Guardian did a good investigation. It's really worth looking at into carbon offset, and it found that the majority offset projects that have sold the most carbon credits are likely junk. And there's questions asked there about whether this is just mass greenwashing, because are we actually detracting from the harder and more difficult challenge of directly reducing emissions? Regardless, taking all of that into account, we potentially have another wave, and we do have another wave of absentee corporate ownership of land in Scotland. Only it's being done under a green guise.
It's capturing of the commons as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, it's corroding the stake and say that communities have in greening land. So this is and it has also been a very kind of private sector led approach to land to nature restoration as well. So the figure touted was around 20 billion to restore nature in Scotland. Realistically, there's been a lot of questions asked about that, and it's much smaller. We don't know the exact figure yet, but it is much smaller. Because that figure was so colossal, and because we have fiscal constraints in Scotland, it wasn't then viewed as an option to look at a public or community-led approach to nature restoration. It can and should be. Because actually a private-led approach to this comes with many risks. It comes with an unknown price tag. There's a kind of move towards de-risking, which is where the state bears some of the risks associated with private investment. Some people have compared this to PFI for nature. And investor profits are also dependent on a huge range of public subsidies, where we have this paradox again, where actually it's reliant on public subsidies. So what should we do instead? Firstly, we need to assess the true nature of the finance gap in Scotland. That's critical. Secondly, I think we need to conduct an appraisal of different private investment models. That includes subsidies, that includes impact of public finance and how that aligns with the just transition. Next, we need to assess the cost and benefits of a private finance-led approach against alternative public and community-led approaches to this. And lastly, we need reviews of if carbon offsetting is actually diverting capital away from investment in emissions reduction. Laurie, my colleague, has just written a really good briefing on this. We also did a big paper for Community Land Scotland about a year and a half ago now, longer than that. I don't know where time's gone. For Community Land Scotland on the rise of so-called green lairds and what alternative approaches we could do instead. And so what we put forward was basically the only approach that we felt was aligned with community wealth building. And that would look at scaling up community-owned land in Scotland. It's about curtailing absentee land ownership in Scotland to build community power, promoting new models of ownership for the common good, different models of democratic ownership, as I mentioned earlier, establishing new sources of finance for community wealth building, that can include the Scottish National Investment Bank, and aligning public funding with community wealth building principles. So, for example, looking at land-related public funding like grants. How do we align that with fair work, with a real living wage for all, with banning 0 hours contracts, with harnessing a drive to net zero, and with good green unionised, particularly focus on rural jobs as well.
Great. My recommendation was for Scotland to withdraw from any carbon markets. just say it was not supportive of carbon markets. One of my favourite economists, John Harvey, says that we should view markets like a carpenter views a tool. And if you're, it's like you say, if you were to ask a carpenter, are you pro hammer? He would say, well, it depends if I'm hammering in a nail or not. Whereas if you ask an economist, are you pro markets? A neoclassical economist says yes. And we need to look at there's a role for markets in certain areas, and I think that markets should not be involved in carbon sequestration and offsets. I think that's something the Scottish Government could do, because it's actually within its gift not to get involved in that market. In this market system that we've got, the huge issue is that I think it was Anne Pettifor who said down in Hollywood that nature doesn't have a credit card. And the idea that there's profit in restoring peatlands, and these are things that are huge issues for us as a society to realise. And I think this involvement with private capital and the involvement with capital being in the market shows that we've got a complete misunderstanding of how we're going to progress when we don't have the resources to be able to make these huge changes, and we're relying on private capital to do it, which is looking for a profit.
You will never catch me say that think tanks should be the only people saying anything. Please don't leave that up to us. No, it takes a whole ecosystem and infrastructure of different groups and communities to push things in the right direction. That's community groups, that's land trusts, that's development trusts, that's campaign organisations. It's social movements doing the direct action. It's people working on policy. It's and
Scotonomics.
No, exactly. But things like this is exactly what I mean. Like, it's an ecosystem, and it needs every player in that ecosystem to be involved and engaged, and reaching out to different audiences. And so I think that's a great point. And I think people's assemblies is a really interesting one too. In Shetland, we've got something called the Alting debate, and Alting, I believe, is the word for local parliaments in Norse. And there's Alting debates that are held frequently in Shetland on all sorts of local issues, and it's sometimes frustrating, obviously, but as local debates can be, but actually it's a really amazing thing that folk turn up and hash out issues that are really important to the community, and that's a really beautiful thing, and it's democratic engagement. I think it's not just voting, it's all of this that matters as well in your democratic engagement. I've scribbled down notes which I now can't read. Nature, yes. I think looking at successful examples of nature restoration done well, was that so there's some brilliant case studies done by Community Land Scotland, and you'll find them on their website, and they've got fantastic case studies of how nature restoration can be done at a community-owned level, and drawing from case studies throughout Scotland. And that ranges from, woodland crofts to community-owned land, to tree planting, to peatland restoration that are, public and community-led. So really encourage you to engage with their work. They're absolutely phenomenal as an organisation.
Well, thanks everyone for your comments and questions. We'll be able to go through a few of them, I'm sure. First thing to do is to welcome Karen back. Hello, Karen. How are you doing? Can I get your thoughts and comments first before we go to the audience?
Well, that was a really varied interview. It covered lots of different subjects. So I picked out a few things that were of interest to me. The climate crisis and inequality being linked. I think that's something that we really have to keep talking about as well, the inequality, both within the country that we live in and also, between the global north and the global south. The other thing that she was talking about as well, we were talking about pollution, that really struck with me. We are having a lot of trouble convincing people to keep cars out of our city centre in Aberdeen. It's quite contentious. A lot of people want to drive into the city centre. And I was looking up the young girl who died in London. I remembered it very distinctly when it happened, because they were saying that this would probably be the first time that someone had actually died from pollution, and the coroner said that. And actually the inquest confirmed it in 2020, but she died in 2013. It's a girl called Ella Adu Kissy Deborah. And I'm actually just reading that between 8 and 12 children with asthma continue to die in London every year, and between 22 and 24 across the UK. And as one of our officers put it really succinctly, there is no safe level of emissions. There's just no, so there's so much that we need to do in so many different areas. And I think Miriam covered a lot of them, and very eloquently as well, But that's something that is of particular interest to me.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, a really enjoyable interview as well. And I think Fraser Stewart, who joined us about 6 weeks ago, drew that connection between inequality and the just transition as well. There's no transition unless it's just. And I did like the question from the audience, which was, is this just for certain parts of the country, or is this for the whole country? And I think there's clear confusion around what this just transition is, who it covers. And there's also a question about people moving from one industry to another. And again, I think that for me, that limits the scope of what a just transition is. It isn't about moving out of manufacturing and fossil fuels into manufacturing other equipment, which is heavily resource intensive. It's about changing the nature of our economy, making our economy much more care orientated. So there's a huge aspect to this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of the work from Future Economy Scotland. I think they're doing some really great work. Just going through some of our comments and questions. Again, thanks very much for your engagement. I think it was Charles who said this seems like a really good example of why we need to be a currency issuer when we're trying to address these problems. And I've highlighted that. And also there was a comment saying, well, can't local councils do a lot more? And I'm sure they can do a little bit more, but they're not a currency issuer. They've got a set budget. They have to find the money. If you want your council to spend more, it's either got to come from Holyrood and not be spent on other things, or it's got to come from you, and you're not able to spend it because we don't issue currency. So I think if these transformational changes to our economy can only be funded by a government that can create currency, can spend it, and then can get rid of it through taxation. And no way can Scotland achieve this without its own currency. So thanks, Charles, for highlighting that. I think Hashbury said, oh, I'm not sure, but I hope that we're getting this message across that with your own currency, if Scotland becomes independent again, it gives you a much deeper and wider set of tools to be able to do that. So I thought those were a couple of points to pick up. Kieran, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as a councillor, I can tell you that all councils are very currency constrained and have been after 13 years of austerity. And I noted in the budget that Rachel Reeves, and a few other people noticed this, that we're getting extra money coming to the Scottish Parliament, and there is a little bit of an attitude coming from Westminster. It's almost with a wagging finger. Now spend it wisely, Scotland. Yeah. Now, what the audience need to know is that the Scottish Government spends a very large percentage of the money that it gets on the National Health Service, and a bigger proportion than it did when the Parliament first started in 2000. So quite a bigger proportion. So I have colleagues who would very dearly like more money to come to the council, and I would like to see more money coming to the council as well. But I guess if you're limited for money, as the Scottish Government is limited for currency, first and foremost, you need to make sure that you can pick people up off the streets, fix them when they're broken, fix them when they have cancer. This is probably the thing that is most important.
Other things are secondary concern, aren't they?
Yeah, but as a council, yes, we would love to have more money. There's lots of things we could. I would personally like to have more staff so that we could improve the amenity for a lot of places. So I'd like more gardeners we're people to look after our grounds, and improve the amenity. I would like to have more joiners. I'd like to more plumbers, electricians, so that we could turn over our council housing faster. It's also not sometimes just about the money. It's also about, are those real resources lying around for us to purchase? And in the case of the council, it's quite difficult to get some of these trades because the private sector are competing for them too.
Yeah.
And if they're a rare commodity, then we can't compete with private sector wages. So there's not just a currency constraint, there's also a real resource constraint for us as well.
That's a really important point, because I had a discussion today. I was down in Glasgow speaking with Community Land Scotland, and they were also talking about this idea that, maybe the Scottish Government wants to spend X amount, or if it can get foreign direct investment to spend X amount. But what if there's not the resources? What if the example was Swiss hedge fund wants to create 300 million worth of carbon credits in Scotland, but there aren't 3 million saplings just lying around. We really need to look at the resources, but we also have to look at the wider impact on the economy. What does this do in terms of employment? What does it do with inflation? It's not about just the monetary value, it's, as you said, on the resources. And my final point, which was something I've never mentioned before, but you raised there, Scotland gets money as a byproduct of what is needed in England, and this is the block grant. So if England thinks it needs to spend more money on health, then Scotland gets some money on health. We never drive what is needed for Scotland. It's only a condition of the money and the decisions that are made in England. And this was a comment made by someone in Wales. It's exactly the same. What an appalling way to run any system, when you're given the resources simply because the bigger part needs it and you get a percentage of it. And this is the position that we're in. We're never able to target our problems and the issues because we are never given them. We are unable to decide on where that money is spent. And these are huge issues that I think have to be discussed at a much wider level when we're talking about the currency that's needed for any transformation, never mind a big seismic transition like the just transition.
Yeah, I think that's a really succinct point, is that, being a currency issuer means that we can tailor our economy and resources to what's really required. And there's another example. Our health board struggles to get people as well. So they advertise for people and they can't get them. So their action towards that is then creating a film showing people what life is like in Aberdeenshire and the Murray area, so that they can see the quality of life up here, and that might pull some people up. But the flip side is, when you move to a more rural area from a more urban area, you will find that there aren't a lot of the facilities that you enjoyed in an urban area, and that can be a bit of a shock for some people. That, for example, I have friends also in Shetland who were having twins, and they had to come down to Edinburgh to have those twins. So you're not always going to get every single resource in a more rural area, but that's what makes it rural. So it can be difficult to pull people to certain areas if they've been really used to living in another type of area as well. And for example, with teachers, they might be living with someone who can't get a job in the same place as them. So if their partner can't move, then you've also got an issue. And that's where a job guarantee would really work, is when you're trying to pull a particular resource or human resource into one area, having a job guarantee for their partner would really help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, you've highlighted one of the issues with the just transition. You maybe stop a job in Aberdeen and create a similar or a very different job somewhere else, but it's not as easy for someone just to move from an area of the country where their partner is, where their kids are, where they've got roots, to get another job. And in the same way, it's not easy for someone to stop being an engineer and become a carer. So these are huge issues, and it's not just about finance, it's about understanding the resources. But I think fundamentally, within the union, we have to have a much more of a say about what we need. And when we become independent again, we need to be in a position where we have our currency. and we're able to spend that to release the resources that we want in our country. And if we have to borrow it or take it from somewhere else, then we lose all the power. Those are some of the issues that we continually go on about on Scotonomics. I hope we're getting through to a lot of people in their audience, and thanks everyone for your support. Well, that's us. We'll see you next week. I was able to spend about 45 minutes with MMT economist Eric Temoyne a few days ago. Actually, it was yesterday, because we were speaking about what could happen with the election. We're going to show that next week. It's a wonderful interview, and it's really talking about how you move MMT as a discipline from the descriptive part to the prescriptive. So I think it's, you know, a really kind of foundational interview that we got with Eric about talking about how this discipline can change. So please do join us. The following week, we've got a live interview with Jack Polanski, the deputy leader of the English and Welsh Green Party, which is a little bit of a coup for us. So that'll be a wonderful interview, and we can see who's someone who kind of gets MMT and gets the problems with growth and a lot of the other issues that we talk about on the show. A politician to come on and talk with us. We've got more episodes before the end of November, which Kieran and I are just finalising, and also into December. So thanks so much for support. If you don't support us on Patrons at the moment, please do consider doing that. We've got big plans next year. It'd be great to have your support, and however you can do that, even if it's just liking, sharing, watching the show. We really appreciate that. Hopefully we'll see you all next week for an MMT themed episode. Until then, bye for now.
Good night.